In the following presentation, we will discuss the role of surgeons on board slave ships during the peak of the slave trade in the 18th century. We will discuss the roles of the surgeon as well as the conditions found on the ships they were in charge of. During the transportation of slaves to the Americas, slave traders began employing surgeons on board their ships in order to keep their slaves healthy along the way. This became a common practice among slave traders, not because they cared for the well-being of their passengers, but because the high mortality rates in transition to the Americas, in some cases being as high as 20%, were seen as a loss of potential income for the slave trader, and the employment of a surgeon could potentially allow them to transport a much larger number of healthy slaves that could sell well. Despite the modern positive connotation we give the word surgeon today, it is important to recognize that these men often did not view those under their care as patients. Their efforts were not made in an attempt to make the slaves comfortable, but rather to ensure that they would survive the journey, as they were usually paid more based on the number of healthy slaves they were able to deliver. When we think of a surgeon today, images come to mind of doctors performing life-saving operations on extremely ill patients in order to save their lives. That was not the role of a surgeon on board a slave ship. Their job was simply to maintain the health of the slaves through whatever methods they believed would work best. These methods included forcing the slaves to eat, even if they didn't want to, and keeping a careful eye out for any slave that might become ill and contagious to the rest of the ship. In these cases, the sick slave would often be isolated for the rest of the voyage, or in the worst cases, cast overboard so as not to infect the rest of the ship, which to the slave trader would have been a disastrous financial loss. Despite their tactics being cruel, they were successful, in some cases bringing the fatality rate of slaves from 15% all the way to as low as 4%. Even with the addition of surgeons on board, the conditions on these ships were not pleasant. Slaves were often abused, fed only what the surgeon deemed necessary to keep them alive. In some cases, malnourishment would get to the point that the slaves would develop scurvy or dysentery, despite it being well known at the time that citrus fruits could provide the vitamins necessary to prevent scurvy in the first place. While it was important to slave owners that as many of their slaves survived the journey as possible, it was also crucial that they could transport as many of them as possible on board the ships. Slaves were often bound and forced to lay head to toe to each other for the entire voyage, in order to fit as many of them on the ship as possible. This system did allow for ships to transport a large number of slaves, but as you can imagine, having that many people in close proximity is not very sanitary, and with the prevalence of slaves developing diarrhea and various other ailments along the voyages, maintaining sanitary conditions in these environments would prove very difficult for the surgeon on board. In addition to being forced to lay in close proximity to one another for weeks on end, slaves were commonly forced to remain bound in chains for the entirety of the journey. These shackles, after being on for so long, would often cause injuries of their own, which were prone to getting infected. In this image, we can see the various routes slave ships were taking during the height of the slave trade. It is important to recognize that crossing these vast distances at the time took months, and living in the conditions previously described on board these ships, it is no surprise that they often had an alarmingly high mortality rate. It should also come as no surprise that the slaves on board these ships did not always take this egregious mistreatment lying down. Slave rebellions on board these ships occurred often, and despite being weakened by malnourishment and muscle atrophy due to lack of movement, the number of slaves on board was far greater than the amount of crewmen, and some of these rebellions even succeeded. Physical revolts were not the only form of protest available to a slave on board these ships. Often, as a last attempt at having agency over their own lives, the slaves would refuse to eat in an attempt to starve themselves to death to escape their awful circumstances. This issue was another job of the surgeon, who would be tasked with forcing the slave to eat, in some cases going as far as to torture the slave until they agreed to eat their rations.